Ted Kennedy was born on February 22, 1932, to Joseph and Rose Kennedy in Boston, Massachusetts. The youngest of 9, he would be the last of the Kennedy children. Ted received his education at Milton Academy and would later go on to study at Harvard University and the University of Virginia School of Law. On November 7, 1962, Kennedy was sworn into the United States Senate. For the next 46 years, 9 months, and 19 days, Kennedy would become the 4th longest-serving senator in United States history. Stephen Collins, also Massachusetts native, worked on Senator Kennedy's staff as a legislative assistant for foreign policy in the 1970s and 80s. Stephen agreed to answer a few of our questions about his time with Kennedy.
I began working for Senator Kennedy in 1973, and I stayed with him from 73 through 1980 when he ran for the presidency. During that time, he was the senior ranking member of the Democratic Party. He was considered the leader of the Democratic Party. Some of those years were with a Republican president. When I began, it was with President Nixon, and it was in the middle of the Watergate controversy, which ultimately led to President Nixon's resignation in 1974. So I worked for Senator Kennedy during that time. Part of the time I was in Massachusetts also when he ran for re-election, and then again with him when he ran for president in 1980. I was a legislative assistant for foreign policy for Senator Kennedy. That meant working to keep him up to date on what was going on in the world, in foreign affairs, ensuring that he was sufficiently briefed every day on current events as they were taking place around the world. He was a man who did probably several interviews with worldwide and U.S. media every day, so he had to be kept up to speed on what was occurring around the world. Also, to advise him on legislation as it came up in the Senate, on the merits of the legislation, on the pros and cons of the legislation, and so that he was able to make a decision on how to proceed to vote on legislation before the Senate. He was a United States Senator. He was one of the longest, if not the longest, serving senators in the U.S. Senate. He became a senator in 1962 at the age of 30, which is the minimum age required to hold that office. At the time, his brother was the president, John Kennedy. His other brother was the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, and he was elected as a senator from Massachusetts. He held that seat until his death in 2009. Well, this was a pretty amazing period of U.S. history. As I said, at the time that I started, the biggest event going on was Watergate, and charges against the President of the United States that he had obstructed justice and had lied, and that he had used the FBI and other federal offices to try to seek to protect himself from the consequences of the Watergate break-in of the Democratic National Committee by operatives that worked for the White House. This went on for about a year, and I was there during all that time. Senator Kennedy was considered then the leading Democrat who was in office at the time as I said, the loyal opposition to President Nixon in the White House. I was there when President Nixon in Senator Kennedy's office, and President Nixon resigned.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour.
President Ford then became president and presided in the White House for the next year or so. Other policy issues that were going on in the world in which we were very involved at the time was there were a number of dictatorships which usually military dictators had taken over control of the governments, for example, in Latin America, in Chile, and several other countries in Latin America. the Marcos family in the Philippines. The Philippines was an ally, and other governments that we supported, that we were providing both military and political support to, but that were actually, because of the Cold War, because if you were anti-communist or you were more inclined towards to have a better view of the U.S. than Russia, then we'd be your friend, no matter what kind of government you had. So we began to challenge that in the 1970s. Senator Kennedy was very, very involved in that, in calling for the U.S. to certainly stop military aid to countries such as Chile, where a military dictator had taken control and killed many, many, many people. That's still controversial there to this day. And then, and when we went to Iran to question the Shah of Iran about the policies that he was pursuing, which were considered very, very quasi-dictatorial, and eventually led to the downfall of the Shah of Iran. He was thrown out of the country, and the Ayatollah Khomeini and the government that's still a problem for us in Iran then took over. We didn't have any of the kinds of technological devices that we have now to be able to keep in touch with each other. For example, this will seem very quaint to you, but this is how it was when we wanted to communicate to our office in Boston, communicate documents or anything like that. We used the first ever fax, which was considered remarkable, that you had this oily, greasy kind of chemical paper that you used to communicate documents to your office in Boston. Now that was the beginning of also putting out press releases by fax. This is pre-computers. There were no computers. Pre-cable television. There was not instant news, 24 hours a day. It was the major networks that provided the news, or your local network. So we had press secretaries, and they would put out press releases. I can remember taking them by hand, or by cab, down to the Washington Post to deliver the press releases and statements. Senator Kennedy usually communicated by speeches. He was a major, major speaker, and it was sought after all over the country. Ted Kennedy was a fantastic guy to be with and to be around. I mean, he just had a really naturally funny, outgoing, gregarious disposition. He was personally a lot of fun to be with. He loved to sing. He loved to anybody's birthday or any occasion, and we'd have to have a gathering in his office with some cake or something, and we'd sing. And so he loved that sort of thing. And so it was like they were glorious times. The very first week I worked for him in 1973, very first week, he was not there for quite a bit of the week. And I thought, well, that's sort of odd. He's not in the office as much as I expected him to be. And then that first Friday night, I was met some people after work, and I heard we saw on the news that his son, his I think 11-year-old son, Ted Jr., had been diagnosed with cancer in his leg, and he had his leg amputated the next morning at Georgetown Hospital. So those are just some of the things this man was dealing with. And he had money enough, he had fame enough, he had been blessed enough that he could have done anything he wanted, including nothing. He didn't have to do this. He didn't certainly have to do it for the money. With all of those weights, with two of his brothers assassinated for being in public office and for being Kennedys, who drew such strong reactions, he kept going, and when he didn't have to. I learned so much. I was so privileged. This was my first job, and what a fabulous first job. I mean, it was just fantastic to have this man to be your first boss, who had seen so much, who lived so much, who was such a major political force in Washington and around the world, and as part of his staff and being with him, to also provided access for me to be able to pick up the phone and call anybody, almost anyone, to ask for advice or ask for background or ask them to come in to meet with the senator or whatever, and to sit down on those meetings with world leaders and others. It was tremendous. What I learned from him as a human being was the sense of being able to be optimistic in the face of, so many barriers and tragedies that he had encountered in his life, when any one of which could have caused someone to really melt down. I miss him. Many of us miss him. I was there in the Capitol when his body was brought to the Capitol from his funeral in Boston, and was able to say farewell with a number of other members of his staff. And it was a great day. I remember standing there as his coffin was brought to the Capitol, and it was right below the stairway area where his brother had been inaugurated and given his speech. He said, "Ask not what you do for your country." I mean, we were standing on that stairwell, and Caroline Kennedy was walking by, and standing next to us was, Linda Bird Johnson, the daughter of President Johnson. It's like all this history, 50 years of history, was kind of wrapped up in that one moment, of saying goodbye to him. And it was the end of an era.